here on episode number 43 of the Path to Follow podcast with one of my good friends, Noah Knopf. Noah, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast virtually.
Thanks so much for having me. And great pronunciation of the last name. Usually people get it wrong.
Well, it's funny, I call you Knopfer all the time, but it's Noah Knopf.
Yeah,
And Noah, if you could maybe just introduce yourself. Who are you? Where are you coming from? And what do you do now?
sure. So I'm Noah. I'm currently a Penn Fellow teaching history at Milton Academy up in Massachusetts. Grew up in New York City. Went to college with you, Jake, and I'm joining from my apartment here in Milton.
Awesome. What has your experience as a first-year teacher been like at Milton and part of the Penn Fellowship? The similar experience I had, you're just in the boarding school cohort. What has that been like, especially during such a crazy time with COVID and teaching virtually and hybrid model? How has that worked out for you this first year?
I mean, honestly, I'm loving it. A lot of the time people ask and they have almost like a sympathetic tone in their voice as if it must be such a tough year. In many respects, it is. And I know a lot of people are having a hard year. And there are obviously things that I would change, if I could, about this first year. But I've really enjoyed it. The kids that I work with are fantastic. My colleagues at Milton are awesome, and I learn a lot from them every day. So I'm really enjoying it. I remember we talked earlier in the fall, and you said that teaching is like going to your favorite class every day, and working with kids to help them, develop skills, and also just on whatever journey that they're on in terms of appreciating the material and figuring out who it is they want to be. And yeah, I think it's an awesome profession.
So what made you want to become a teacher? Where'd that start? Did that start in high school? Did you develop that more in college? Or when did that idea to become a teacher and a coach start out for you?
Yeah, I always really loved school, but I hadn't thought necessarily about becoming a teacher. I kind of was just playing things by ear a little bit in the way that maybe kids do. I decided to study history and literature in college because those were the things that I really appreciated and really loved. And the summer after my sophomore year, I was looking for jobs, didn't necessarily know what I wanted to do. I thought maybe I wanted to be a political speechwriter. So I was looking at jobs in speech writing and communications, and that didn't work out. And I ended up getting a job at the East Harlem School in New York, teaching as an intern in their summer session. And I just loved it. I loved working with the kids. I loved being able to share my appreciation for, history and literature and the humanities with them, and for sports as well. And based on that, I was like, I have to keep going with this. I have to keep exploring. So I went to Loomis Chaffee the following summer and worked in their summer program. Loved that as well. Decided to apply to full-time jobs as a teacher.
Awesome. And how about this Penn Fellowship program that you're a part of? I went through it as well, but what has your experience been like in the Penn Fellowship program now, and maybe what are you learning in that program that you're taking and applying to your classes?
I mean, I've loved the Penn part of the fellowship. At first, I didn't know what it was. So I wasn't sure how much I would like it. But I found it to be extremely helpful. A lot of the readings that we do, the papers we write, have really helped me reimagine what good teaching can be. And I would say that based on like the Penn program, my vision for what good teaching can be has totally changed. At the beginning of the year, I think I thought it was, let me bring in, material that I think is really fascinating and that can potentially, influence the way kids see the world and that they'll enjoy, and will help them on, whatever journey it is they're on. And we'll discuss it and they'll write papers about it. And that's sort of my job, is to like be the guide in that sense. And I think now my vision has changed a lot. I think one thing that's different is the role that I think student voice should play in the classroom, rather than me deciding what it is we're going to study, in what order, how we're going to look at it. My vision, and I haven't been able to fully implement it yet. It's a long-term process, but I think now it's, the students should be the ones having a formal voice in determining the overarching direction and inquiry of the class. So how to actually make that happen, how to guide them and scaffold them as they have that voice is something that I'm thinking about more and more.
Now, did you get to choose your own curriculum during your first year at Milton, or did someone hand you that curriculum? Do you have a mentor there? What's that process been like? Because I know coming in my first year teaching at Gilman, I was lucky enough to have a mentor who I would observe him, Brian Ledyard. I would watch his classes, and I would follow his same curriculum and then go teach my class. Is it similar there for you, or is it a different setup?
It's a little different. I was not handed a syllabus of any kind. I was just told, teach US history. And I have a mentor who's fantastic, Catherine Millett, and she teaches in the history department, but this year she's doing modern world and ancient civilizations. So two totally different classes with a different syllabus. I think the main thing that I spend most of my time on is thinking about what we're actually going to read and study. So I've had, full autonomy in doing that. And that's been something I've valued a lot because it allows us to cover, things that I think are really interesting, and also to try and, get up to parts in US history that I am really fascinated by that happened more recently. I remember my own US history course when I was in high school. I think we only got up to maybe World War II. And I didn't know anything about the Vietnam War. I only knew a very superficial amount about the civil rights movement. And there have been so many things that have happened in US history since those things as well, which I think are really relevant to understanding the US today. So, my goal was to try and get to those things. And I think that we'll be able to a little bit more, in the last couple months of school. And then the other main goal that I really had was to try and decenter whiteness in the curriculum and bring in as many voices of historically marginalized people as possible. So having autonomy in that sense was great because I didn't have to ask anyone to cut the War of 1812. We just didn't do that. And instead, we read more from Frederick Douglass and from other, figures throughout history.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think that's the best part, in my opinion, too, of teaching at some of these independent schools. You get more autonomy in the classroom. You get to figure out what you're passionate about, what you want to teach in the classroom, and arrange it in that way. You have a lot of freedom as a teacher, which I know a lot of, public schools especially, it's hard to have that same sense of freedom that I think we get more so at independent schools.
Yeah.
Can you take me through a little bit of your maybe high school experience at Fieldston and growing up and really deciding that you wanted to become a teacher and get into education? Were there specific teachers and coaches that you had growing up who played a huge influence in your life and had a large effect on what you would end up getting into after college? Or was it really just intrinsic motivation to become a teacher, and are you just following kind of your own journey there?
No, I think that there were definitely a lot of teachers at Fieldston who influenced me in ways that I probably didn't even understand at the time. It's funny for me to think back to high school because I feel like a lot of disconnect between who I was in high school and who I am now. But there were many teachers at Fieldston, for example, who were queer. And at the time, I was a typical teenage boy lacrosse player. And I don't think that, I understood who I was yet really, and didn't understand the value and importance that those teachers had just in their fact of existing. Growing up, I think in the world of sports, especially, being gay is just something that is equated with being bad in some way or less than. It's the last thing that you want to be in a world where everyone, uses homophobic slurs all the time, etc. So just the fact that queer teachers existed and lived their lives openly at Fieldston, even though I don't think I appreciated it at the time as much as I should have, had a huge subliminal impact on me in terms of just showing that was possible. And I think that, implicitly that was something that drew me to teaching. And it really was like when I started my career as a teacher that something just clicked in my head. And I thought, wow, like this is possible. I could potentially be out and openly gay. And I don't think it's a coincidence that those two things went hand in hand, right? It was really like at the summer when I was at Loomis that I started to actually think that it was a possibility. And I think that that is definitely due to having gay role models to an extent, or just understanding that it was possible. So thank you to all of the queer teachers at Fieldson for existing, even if we might not have known each other so well in high school.
That's pretty awesome and pretty interesting that in your Lacrosse Magazine article, and maybe we can talk
Sure.
about that a little bit. That came out last year or this past
Yeah, I think
fall?
it was this fall. It feels like forever ago. Time and COVID is just like a tunnel.
Yeah, it's a time warp, but maybe you can talk a little bit about the motivation to write that article and your experience coming out at Harvard during your senior year, for people who don't know about that story, since we talked about some of your role models or people who played a role in your life in high school and their impact. Maybe we could talk about the article you wrote and why'd you decide to write it.
Yeah. I think that like even as I was thinking about coming out, the idea of being a role model was something that was like already in my head, particularly in the space of lacrosse and athletics, because it feels to me like that space is still one of the final frontiers where, explicit homophobia in many instances is still a huge part of the culture. Like if you look at the world of lacrosse, there's almost no one on the men's side who's out or openly gay, despite the likely reality that there are many people in that sport who are, queer in some way. Um, so yeah, as I was coming out, I was kind of thinking in the back of my head, like, I would love to try and, be a role model so that the next generation of kids, has it better than I had it, and that, and then many others have had it. And I think that that's also something that's just part of being part of the LGBT community in general, is like this understanding that the world as it is today is not how it always has been. In fact, the world up until extremely very recently has been an incredibly hostile place to LGBTQ people. And it's only because of the work that so many, people who came before us have put in, and the sacrifices they made, and the visibility that they have created, that the world today is like how it is. So yeah, I wanted to be part of that. And I also love to write, and I was sitting around during COVID, and the opportunity kind of presented itself, and I thought that it would be really good. And it was good for me as well to just reflect on things a little bit and put it in writing. It was cathartic in some ways. And the goal, was just, I was trying to imagine myself back in high school and what reading, what seeing like an out gay college player would have meant to me, and how I could sort of phrase the article or write the article in a way that would mean something to a young queer kid who doesn't see people like him or her or them out there. And yeah, that was sort of the goal. And the goal also was to say a little bit to the lacrosse community, like, we have a little bit of a problem on our hands here, in terms of the homophobia that's still so present in most locker rooms in our sport. And I don't think that ignoring that is a way of solving that problem. I think it's got to be named.
Yeah, what do you think contributes to, you said, the homophobia in the sport of lacrosse or in, on different teams? What do you think the factors are or the obstacles are that make that happen so often in the sport of lacrosse? Maybe we can just talk about that, but why do you think that is happening in the culture of lacrosse? What are those factors involved there?
It's a great question. I think that the realistic answer is that it's because it happens in many places. For the majority of time in the U.S., like homophobia was something that was cool, right? Like, it's kind of the vocabulary of day-to-day existence in athletics and in the sport of lacrosse, right? and especially in athletics too, where masculinity and the desire to be strong and manly and glorified is so strong. I think that gayness in a lot of ways is like the opposite of that. You know, the way that people use the word gay or other homophobic slurs is very much explicitly and implicitly opposed to the idea of success that is present in athletics. So there's that, right? There's also the coolness of it. It's just the way people talk, and even to not partake in that culture of homophobia is seen in many ways as a form of like strong dissent, right? To not use those words, or when someone says them, to say, hey, like that's not cool, right? Like that is seen as very uncool in a lot of ways, and I think that that's a big obstacle. And lastly, I mean, I think like I feel like there's a sentiment in lacrosse that, you know, we understand within the lacrosse community that our sport has a problematic reputation at times. You know, the way it's portrayed sometimes in popular culture and in movies, and I think just the things that we hear about lacrosse, right, the jokes that are made, that a lot of people see the sport as problematic, as wealthy, as white, as elitist, as threatening in many ways, as having a drinking culture. And I think that our reaction within lacrosse is to say, well, we're really nice guys, you know, like, and I'm talking specifically about the men's game, especially because that's what I know. But to say, hey, we're really nice guys. Like if only the world would know, you know, what nice people we were, then, you know, this stereotype wouldn't exist. And I think that, you know, sometimes we have to be a little bit more honest with ourselves and say, hey, like this stereotype potentially exists, you know, for a reason, right? You know, what are the things that are not the best about our culture that we need to work on? And I think that, you know, the drinking culture is one thing. I think that within the men's game, the way that women are treated or spoken about is another thing. The homophobia is another thing. The fact that it's a predominantly white sport is another thing. The fact that it's an extremely wealthy sport is another that we have to look at. So I love lacrosse. You know, I'm not trying to bash it in any sense. I'm just trying to, you know, be realistic and say, you know, there are issues within lacrosse that I feel, you know, should be addressed so that this game can be a game for everyone, and so that it can honor like the roots of the game, which come from Native Americans. And yeah, I think that the lack of willingness to talk about shortcomings within the culture of the sport is another obstacle.
So in your article in Lacrosse Magazine, I loved some of the language you used in that. It's so well written, but one of the things that you said was it was the day that you told the Harvard men's lacrosse team your senior year, you know, before practice or whatever, it was an extraordinary day for you. It was a big moment in your life, but you also described it as an ordinary day, right? It was another day, right? An extraordinary, ordinary day. Why did you choose those words? That made such an impact on me when I read those, but why'd you choose extraordinary, ordinary right next to each other?
So a little bit goes back to, this isn't the book rec that I brought, but you know I would end up talking about it. I think I really have a book that has really influenced me was Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, and other books by Woolf as well. And what I really loved about that book was like her portrayal of just an average day in extraordinary terms. You know, going through a regular day in your life, but feeling blessed and, you know, feeling the grace of the world and feeling the complexity and miraculousness of everyday life. So I had actually used that same phrase, and I guess like as a writer, you steal from everyone, like including yourself. I had used that same phrase in an article I wrote about Mrs. Dalloway at one point. So I ripped it off and brought it there because that was sort of, I think a phrase that summed up, you know, what I wanted from that experience, and like was really fortunate to have, was, you know, a day that was different from all the days of my life previously, in that now everyone around me knew a secret that I had never thought that I would tell them. But also a day that was ordinary in the greatest sense of the word, because it was a day where we got to play lacrosse together. It was a day where I went to class. You know, it was a day where like I experienced all the things that, you know, we were so lucky to experience as students at Harvard, and not to be treated any differently or looked at in like a negative way. So it was extraordinary and it was ordinary. And I think those two things are very much interrelated.
Yeah, I love that. And you also described that senior year for you was there's so much going on. You had the COVID season that happened later on, but what was it
Right.
about that group of guys, that team, your class that
Yeah.
made you telling them that so comforting and supportive for you? What was that team dynamic like?
Yeah. I think, we were a very close team. And I'm sure that you felt this as well when you were there. Just naturally the team was very close. Um, we spend a lot of time together. We go through some stuff together. Um, and I think, when I was younger, I did feel somewhat like a little bit of an outsider in the group at times, because I was a little different in some ways. As I got older, I started to feel a lot more a part of things. Um, and that, definitely played a role. I think I wrote in the article, um, that like I knew people would see me as Noah first and the gay kid second, and I think that does a little bit speak to the troubling nature of coming out. If I had been an openly gay freshman coming into the program, I sometimes wonder what would the reaction to that have been,
Mm-hmm.
if people would have been on board with that, if it would have taken some time. But I had been on the team for 3 years, 3.5 years. I felt like I really was tight with a lot of the players. And yeah, I really wanted them. I really wanted them to just know me in the full scope of who I was. So I was grateful to them for their acceptance and their reaction.
Awesome. So thinking back to the article a little bit more, and for people who haven't read it, I strongly suggested to check it out because again, it's really well written, and you reveal an important message in there. I think to younger players, whether they're involved in lacrosse or involved in athletics, doesn't really matter, right? It's for younger people who are struggling maybe or thinking about their identity and what that might be like for them. What is your maybe main message, or what would you tell, say, a middle school lacrosse player who's experiencing something that you experience, and what advice would you have for them?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, the first thing I would say is that whoever you are, you should be 100% feeling good about it. I phrased that terribly, but
No, I know what
whoever it
you.
is that you are, like,
Yeah.
that's great. In fact, like, rather than just even being okay with it, you should celebrate it. I wish that I had been, more able to come to terms with who I was, at such a young age. And the other thing is, you can be whoever you want to be and still play lacrosse. And coming out takes time, and everyone's circumstances are different, right? And you have to do it in a way that is, healthy for you. I wish, so much that I could have all of the time that I was in the closet back. I think that it would be, so fantastic to be able to relive those years, within the full scope of myself. And I think in some ways, like, my decision to teach is like almost, trying to like get that back for myself, like, but through other people in some ways, at
Mm-hmm.
some level. Not that
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to like relive my own life, the lives of students, but just to try and say like, and be a role model and say like, hey, you can do this. That's the main message: is you can do this. And it may be hard at times, but it'll get a lot better, and it'll be worth it.
Awesome. It's a great message. It's really important, I think, for people to feel okay with who they are, and that's really why I wanted to have you on today, and why I'm glad you wrote that article, is to express that and be that role model
Right.
for
Right.
younger players in lacrosse and just in general.
Yeah.
Um,
I think like, I was listening to your conversation with Jim Harbaugh, and I really loved what the two of you were talking
John,
about. We
John,
all, oh my gosh, listen, I'm
that's his
not a football
brother.
fan.
That's his brother.
Uh, John, if you're listening, I'm really sorry.
You're a soccer
Um,
guy. It's all right.
I am a soccer guy. I don't follow the NFL very much. But what you and John were saying, we all kind of look in the mirror, especially when we're young, and we think like, am I to this? Am I to that? How could I be better? Do people like me? I think that that's like such a shared experience that so many of us have. And so often, like, the sense of normalcy or of, being mainstream or being cool or being liked is some abstract ideal that's really not attainable for everyone, or excuse me, for anyone.
Hmm.
Like, the invisible or imaginary ideal of the cool person or the in person, it just doesn't exist. And we all kind of walk around thinking I'm insufficient in this way or that way, or I don't fit in this way or that way. And we don't realize that everyone else is thinking the same thing too. So I think that, trying to be okay with ourselves and, accepting who we are is just a big part of being human. So, more than just a queer experience, it really is, it really is, I think, something that we can all, think about, how can I be okay with myself? And I don't have to live up to the expectations that I am imagining that other people have of me.
Yeah, it's an important message, I think. And like I said in that podcast, especially today, because I think there are even more or additional pressures with social media and
Yeah.
just how public everything is. And you kind of feel
Right.
maybe like you're being judged on various angles, not just in person, but from
Right.
people on, Instagram or TikTok or whatever it is, right?
Right.
So I think that's
Yeah. I mean,
important for kids today.
it's hard, it's hard growing up in this world of social media because, not only are you seeing people, right, like living idyllic lives in their posts, but you're expected to be the author of similar content as well. Like, you are expected to put stuff out there, and then you are, like, evaluated numerically based on how many likes you get, right? It's very disheartening in a lot of ways. And I think that if you're young, like I still am, sometimes you can look at that and say, like, wow, no one likes me. This didn't get, literally, no one likes me.
Hmm. Hmm.
It didn't get enough content or enough likes. And that's really hard as a young person.
Yeah, it's important that there are role models, like you said, role models, people to look up to and say, like, Noah's okay with this. He's sharing his story. He's sharing his message, right? And that can help younger people. Um, let's talk a little bit about your experience at Harvard as a student athlete, but maybe as a student first. Who were some of the um, best teachers or professors that you had at Harvard, and what was your favorite class you ever took?
Such a hard question, honestly, because I mean, like, all of the teachers there are really, really quite good. Um, I remember, like, you show up freshman year and you're going to these lectures and the teachers are just saying things that are blowing your mind, and I'm, like, stumbling out of the lecture hall because the teacher has just, like, said things that I have never even heard of or thought about that
Hmm.
are totally, influencing the way I experience reality and life. Um, some of my favorites were definitely the history and literature courses, because those were a little smaller and you got to, get to know people a little bit. The teachers were committed to getting to know you and were really just thoughtful people. I loved America in the 1980s with Angela Allen. I studied 3 times with Steve Beale, who is in history and literature. The first time we did the Vietnam War and American culture, which was a class that, like, hugely influenced my understanding of America. I had never heard about the Vietnam War before or learned about it, and learning about that conflict totally reshaped my understanding of the U.S. in a lot of ways. The next time we studied together was World War One, the history and literature of World War One, and then he was my thesis advisor. And we came back to Vietnam, and I wrote a thesis about how disabled Vietnam War veterans protested the war and also the American culture of militarism and also, American masculinity. So those were some highlights for me.
Excellent. What led you to your major, Hist and Lit? Was there a specific class that you took that made you want to decide to do that, or how did that play out?
Well, both my classes with Steve and with Angela were Hist and Lit classes. And I always have been someone who, loves both sides of, that spectrum, the history and the literature, right? You can't really fully understand the literature without, um, understanding it in context. And then when you're studying history, like people study history very differently. The way that I'm really interested in studying history is through the voices and the human experiences of the people who lived it, rather than sort of like at a macro level of what events led to other events or trends or things like that. I'm much more interested in like the human experience of history. So literature is that in many respects.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And then playing a sport, playing lacrosse, I know what that's like, but reflecting on your own experience as a student athlete, what would you tell someone who's thinking about playing a sport in college, specifically lacrosse? What was it like to be an athlete as well as a student and have to balance all of your extracurriculars and your academics and all the things that you have to carry while being a student athlete in school? What was that experience like for you?
I mean, I loved it, and it was really hard. Um, I don't think I understood when I signed up as a 16-year-old how hard it was going to be and how challenging, mentally. I was very confident in myself, very much a believer in my ability and in my work ethic. And I think I even remember, looking at the Harvard team and looking at guys who didn't play and almost thinking implicitly in my head, man, like they probably just don't work that hard or something. Like when I get there, like I'm going to work really hard and like I'll make it, I'll make it happen. And it's way harder than you think it will be. Everyone is an extremely hard worker. Everyone is really talented. Everyone was the captain of their high school team. So I didn't imagine that necessarily would be the case. And when I showed up, I was a little bit blown off my feet by how intense the level of competition was and the desire to get better. I also was really committed to my schoolwork and trying to make everything happen and be really good at everything. And that was a big challenge. And I had to learn, some time management a little bit, which I was actually fairly good at. But it wasn't so much like the ability to organize a calendar that I needed to learn as the ability to navigate a busy schedule and like still feel okay and like be healthy and be positive and experience things in a positive way. That was the skill that I really needed to acquire.
And have some time for yourself and time to reflect
Exactly.
and slow things down, because one of the things that I think about in terms of our college experience was how fast it goes. It's 4 years, but it flies by because you're so busy.
Flies by. You're busy.
I joke with my roommates all the time that we only had a few occasions where we were kind of just sitting on the couch, hanging out, and just enjoying it, because it's always A to B, B to C, practice for 6 hours or whatever. It's a lot of your time if you're going to choose to play a sport in college, but it's really what you sign up for. It's just finding those moments where you can enjoy it, really, I think.
100%. I think I remember like my sophomore year, there was a time where I was like waking up 7 a.m., and not going to bed till 2 a.m. And everything in between was some form of classwork or like putting some food in me or being at practice and being there. And that was just not sustainable for a 19-year-old. I was exhausted. I was drinking coffee. I was unhappy. Couldn't wait for the year to be over. As much as I hate to say it. So I think if I could go back and do those, especially those first couple of years differently, I'd put a lot less pressure on myself. Like I wouldn't try and be like the best at everything. Sometimes you have to like let things go and pursue what you're interested in a little bit more than, again, like pursuing this ideal that you think other people expect of you, which is to take hard classes, get amazing grades, succeed in lacrosse. You just can't do everything. And I think I would try and be okay with that if I could do it again and spend a little more time relaxing.
Interesting. And it's also easier said than done, but coming in, because there's so many competitive people around you. That's why sometimes I say that experience is not for everyone, because it is mentally taxing, because everyone in your peripherals is striving and the hardest worker in the room and super competitive. And you have to keep up in some ways too. So,
I agree. It's hard. The other thing I'll say though is like the challenge of it was really something that helped me a lot. Like I think at the end of my sophomore year, I was like, I just had like a little bit of a private moment of reflection where I was thinking, this isn't working, especially in lacrosse. Like the way I've been going through our program for the last 2 years isn't working. Like my freshman year was miserable and, just working myself too hard, the same my sophomore year. And I was like, I haven't given this my best shot yet. Like I work hard all the time when we are there, right? Like I don't doubt myself in terms of working hard in practice, in the weight room, and like giving my best in those moments. But I haven't taken a moment yet and said like, how can I look at my whole life and like reorganize that? And that's what you have to do as a student athlete, basically, is say, how can I live my whole life around the question, what will make me a better lacrosse player for the Harvard team, or allow me to contribute to the Harvard team? And I think that like the challenge of looking at it that way and saying, okay, like I'm going to make some big life changes, make some sacrifices.
What were some of those changes you made or sacrifices you made after sophomore year?
Well, I think like, socially, like I'm a person who's like just not as naturally gifted and athletic as a lot of other people, right? There were people on our team even who could live a vibrant social life and still be extraordinarily quick and explosive and fast and flexible. And if you see me run for 30 seconds, you'll be like, no, it's not that person. He's a grinder. He's got to grind. And sacrificing a little bit of that socially, changing my diet up, sleeping more. I got a whoop.
Oh, that's helpful.
Yeah, it's kind of a reminder. It's just like sort of changing the question. I think we all kind of make our decisions. This is a little theory of mine. We all kind of make our decisions based on questions. Like when we go through life, we're like, we have an implicit question or an implicit value that's present in everything. And I think that like I had to change up my question a little bit. Like my question had to become, is this the best decision for me to be, the best teammate and lacrosse player I can be? So when it came to like eating, the question had to go from, is this what I want to eat? Will it be delicious? To, is this the best thing for me to be, the best member of the Harvard lacrosse team? And you can amplify that across the board, to sleep, to academic, unfortunately, sometimes to academic work even. I think that lacrosse and a lot of college sports have become so professionalized that unless you are an extraordinarily exceptional person, and I can think of a few, Rob Shaw, if you're listening, unless you are on an extraordinary level, it's very difficult to fully give yourself to both programs at the same time. So, I'm a teacher. I love academics in school. But I did feel at the time as though I needed to take my foot off the gas a little bit. So I stopped studying computer science, for example, because it was a really demanding program. And, I wasn't going to do it as my major. It was my secondary, as my minor. I didn't think that it would, have career implications for me. So I stopped doing that, and that helped me a little bit.
Yep, I had the same experience with computer science. It was too many hours. I was up too many nights at 3 a.m. It just was not sustainable at all.
Right. So it's hard. I mean, it's hard to like prioritize like that as a young person. Another thing that being a student athlete teaches you, though, is like what's really important to me.
Right.
What's really important to me.
A lot of skills you take from that experience. So Noah, let's talk about your book recommendation. What book do you have for us? What should we pick up and why?
All right. So I'm bringing in the Autobiography of Malcolm X. I read this book in my last semester at Harvard while I was home in New York City during the spring of 2020 in quarantine. Season had just ended, was a little despondent, didn't know what to do with myself. This book was an option to read in one of my classes in Cornell West's African American Studies class. So I picked up this book, and I didn't really know much about Malcolm X. I think that it was an extremely impactful book for me. The book is really very much about history. It's about studying history, in my opinion. If anyone doesn't know the story of Malcolm X, he was an extremely bright young student who was enrolled in all-white school when he was young, and his experience of Black history in that school was the teacher reading one paragraph from the textbook about slavery, making a racist joke, everyone laughing, and that was it. And that was his experience of learning Black history when he was young. And then as he got older, right, became a hustler, went through his phase of sort of hustling and drugs in Boston and Harlem. And then he went to prison. And it was actually in prison that he embarked on this extraordinary journey of self-education, where he would read books all night as he discovered the Nation of Islam, read books about history and about science and about the world, all day and all night in his cell, reading late into the night, through a sliver of light through the cracks of his cell door, reading so late that he developed the need for glasses as an adult, which I think is fairly rare, because he was straining his eyes to read all this information. And it was this journey of sort of self-education that made him into the advocate for racial equality that he became. He kind of just looked at the history of America and of the world in general and saw this history of exploitation and evil and racism. And he was a believer that you could share this truth with people and that it would impact them and change how they understood and looked at the world. I brought a quote, which I think is an incredible, humanistic quote, which sums up in many ways who Malcolm X was. I'm for truth, no matter who tells it. I'm for justice, no matter who it is for or against. I'm a human being first and foremost, and as such, I'm for whoever and whatever benefits humanity as a whole, right? An incredible egalitarian mindset based on truth and based on studying history. So I really, valued the book and, think that Malcolm X was an incredible figure, someone with incredible levels of integrity and drive and truth-telling ability. And he certainly, his words certainly influenced my teaching in this first year.
Have you've incorporated him into your class? Have you done some study of this book in your class, and what's that been like?
We didn't read the book. It's a long book, and I'm actually going to try and ask our history department if we can have it be the summer reading book for next year for US. Because again, I think it's a book about studying history, right? If you're a young person today studying history, so much of the process of studying it is saying, like, a lot of the things that I've been taught that are true about the US are not true. And I have to go through this process of unlearning and kind of relearning the truth a little bit. And I think that was the journey that Malcolm X experienced. We didn't do the autobiography. We did some other speeches of his when we looked at the civil rights movement. And during a week of the election in the fall, we read a little bit from the Ballot or the Bullet. As sort of
his most famous speech is the Battle of the Bullet.
Yeah, the Ballot or the Bullet.
The Battle of the Bullet.
And I think Malcolm X has like this reputation in popular culture of being like the foil to King, right? If King advocated for nonviolent resistance, then Malcolm X advocated for violent resistance. And I think like almost the title of the speech, the Ballot or the Bullet, like reinforces that idea of who Malcolm X was. And I think broadly speaking, it's kind of an oversimplification or not true. So, I was glad that we got to look at him a little bit more in depth in our class together. And my students, like, to their credit, were very curious about Malcolm X and about Black Power. We had a professor come speak, Dr. Brenna Wynne Greer, spoke at Milton, and she spoke about like the oversimplification of Martin Luther King in popular culture and the oversimplification of the Black freedom struggle. And she talked about how in her education, including at a PhD program in African American studies, she never received a lesson on Malcolm X or on the Black Panthers or on Black Power. So primed with this talk, I asked my students, I said, what do you want to learn about the civil rights movement? And most of them said, we want to learn about Malcolm X. We want to learn about Black Power and the Black Panther Party. And I said, yes, let's do it. So we didn't have, regrettably, you only have the amount of time you have, and I'm sure you know this as a teacher, is like so limited, but we got to spend some time on Malcolm X and on reading Stokely Carmichael and reading the Black Panther Party 10-point program. And I mean, again, those texts for me were a big learning experience as well.
Awesome. Noah Knopf, huge reader. We talk book recommendations all the time. Noah, anything else we should cover today?
How was your lesson on Evelyn?
So it went really well. I'm glad we had the conversation about that beforehand. And there's so much and this is my favorite part about teaching, is we had that conversation. I've read that story before, but my senior students were picking out aspects of the story that I had not even thought about or noticed in my reading or our conversation. And I think I didn't think that going into teaching, that like, what's a 16-year-old going to tell me about The Great Gatsby, for instance, that I've read 10 times? Right. And every year I learn so much more about that text or about any given reading or story. So that's my favorite part, but I'm glad we talked about that beforehand. I was prepared for class.
I got to tell you, I found the same thing. Going in, you always hear teachers say, like, it's really the students who teach me. And it's like a cliche. And as a student, I was like, really? Like, that doesn't seem right. Like, I'm a student. I know I'm not teaching you anything. Mm-hmm. And as a teacher, I've been like so blown away by my students and what they bring to the text and what they bring to class. Honestly, the things they say blow me away. And I do feel as though I have learned so much more from them than they have from me. So I hate to be, parroting the old cliche, but I agree with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Noah, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It was an awesome conversation. Great role model, great friend, and I appreciate you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me. It was awesome.
Catch up again soon.
Yeah.